This is our last chapter focusing on infants and toddlers, chapter 6. This focuses on social and emotional development, and this version of chapter 6 will focus on the information you need for assignment 1. So we're going to start by talking about a theory of social and emotional development called temperament. Temperament looks at individual differences in temperament or characteristic patterns of behavior and emotion. This is centered on genetic tendencies that are inherited, so it would be nature focus. And when it comes to the basics of child development, it includes the influence of social skills, self-awareness, and adaptation. So when we look at temperament in infants and toddlers, there are some dimensions that we'd want to look at, and some of these dimensions, by the way, continue in a different way throughout life, but since temperament is genetic, this is something that's innately there, and it's not something that we can change, but we can certainly develop skills in response to that genetic tendency. So the first dimension is activity level. Is the child active versus inactive? The second is rhythmicity. Are they predictable in their schedule or unpredictable? And when we say schedule, we're talking about eating and sleeping and the need to have their diaper changed, for example. The third is approach versus withdrawal. So how do they react to new stimulus? Are they really excited and interested, or are they frightened, and do they pull away? Number 4, sensory threshold. Are they just interested in sensory experiences and don't get overwhelmed easily, or are they really sensitive to sensory experiences and get overwhelmed easily? Number 5, intensity of response. When they respond to things, are they very intense? Are they somewhere in the middle, or are they not affected at all by stimulus, and so they have a lower intensity response? 6 is quality of mood. Are they generally positive and smiling and happy, or are they negatively focused? Do they get sad or angry easily and rarely smile? 7, distractibility. This is their ability to focus. And then the last one is persistence. It's the length of time involved in activity. Something we need to keep in mind, particularly on number 7 and number 8, is that we have to consider this in the perspective of their developmental abilities and their age, and not just about their temperament. We have to utilize, when we judge these two in particular, we have to think about compared to other children, their age and developmental level. And so it also refers to variations in behavior and emotion. And Thomas and Chess identified 3 different temperamental types. And this is actually a photograph of the author of your textbooks, 2 daughters, and they're riding on a ride in an amusement park. And so an easy child would be generally happy and enjoy exciting experiences, and that's 40% of children. And you can see that the child on the right appears to be an easy child. A difficult child is someone who doesn't adjust easily, likes things on a regular schedule, positive. Maybe they have generally a negative mood. They're sad, they're angry, they're easily provoked to that. Fortunately, that's only 10% of children. And looking at the child on the left, you might assume that she could possibly be a difficult child, although she could also be slow to warm. And these are individuals who are shy and hesitant and a bit, they are slow to adjust to situations, but they do adjust with time, which that's a difference between difficult and slow to warm. And the percentage of this category is 15%. And you'll notice that these percentages don't add up to 100%. And that's because sometimes children don't conclusively fit in any one particular category. So there are categories within temperament that we also have to consider along with those dimensions and those types. There's negative emotionality, and that's anger, irritability, and behavioral inhibition that we saw, or we talked about in regards to the child on the left and this amusement park ride. And positive emotionality, which is high intensity pleasure, low intensity pleasure, and activity level, which that really focuses on those dimensions of temperament we talked about earlier. And then effortful control, or attention and persistence. And then inhibitory control, or be able to control their behavior. Okay, so these are broad categories of temperament, and those aspects are kind of summarizing those 9 dimensions we talked about earlier. And it's kind of condensed it down to 3: negative emotionality, positive emotionality, and effortful control. So by age 3, ratings of temperament correlate well with ratings at age 4 and older. And so even though this is focused, temperament focuses on genetics, there is an environmental influence that interacts in temperament. And so the concept of goodness of fit is included in the temperament theory. Goodness of fit is the degree with which the environment accommodates a child's temperament and helps the child respond more adaptively to the environment. And so there are several factors that can influence this. For example, if a parent is a difficult temperament and a child is a difficult temperament, there may be some issues with those 2 individuals interacting, and this may also affect attachment, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But it also can be helping the child develop coping skills so that they can adjust and self-control to some extent their reactions to stimulus. And one of the ways that we can do that as caregivers and parents is to educate them on assertiveness skills. And assertiveness is standing up for yourself without infringing on the rights of others. And all of the types of temperament can learn from this. Easy temperaments, what tends to happen is they are taken advantage of. And so being assertive would be an important skill for them. Whereas for the slow to warm and difficult, they don't have any problem standing up for themselves, but they tend to do it in a more aggressive rather than assertive way. And so we need to make sure that we help them develop skills to be assertive rather than aggressive. So shyness or behavioral inhibition is related to that slow to warm category. It's an aspect of temperament that appears heavily influenced by environmental processes and the environment. And compared with uninhibited children, inhibited children show signs of higher physiological arousal. In other words, they can have more of a physical reaction. In behavioral inhibition in infancy interacts with the environment. Parental intervention and child's personal coping skills relate to the level of social anxiety in adolescence. So this just emphasizes that as parents and caregivers, we need to help children develop coping skills in relationship to their temperament, like assertiveness. Social anxiety in adolescence was associated with behavioral inhibition in infancy, in infants, and often if infants had insecure attachments, that has even more of an effect. Okay, so now let's look at theories in regards to social and emotional development, and we're going to look at two psychoanalytic theories, Freud and Erikson. And these theorists are focused more on, well, particularly Freud is focused on the nature aspect, but Erikson kind of blends together nature and nurture. But both of these theorists are discontinuous theorists, so their theories have stages. So both psychoanalytic theories believe that development is primarily unconscious, so it's beyond awareness, so it's genetic. It's heavily colored by emotions. Behavior is a surface characteristic of development. A true understanding of development requires analyzing the meanings of behavior and the deep inner workings of the mind. And to a psychoanalytic theorist, early experiences with parents and caregivers extensively shape development. And we have to bring up caregivers because in the modern world, infants and toddlers often are with caregivers starting as early as 6 weeks, and sometimes earlier than that. So let's look at Freud's theory. So Freud focuses on aspects of how we develop pleasure versus pain principles, and things that feel good versus things that are aversive. And so his stages are focused on aspects of bodily functions and how they relate to social emotional development. And so his first stage is the oral stage, and he calls it the oral stage because there's a positive emotional focus on the mouth and eating and feeding. And then for toddlers, it's the anal stage. And this positive emotion is centered on the development of independence and power through toilet training or learning that we talked about in chapter 4. So we have, for Freud, we have then the oral stage and the anal stage. Erikson bases his ideas on Freud's stages, but he takes it more towards a combination of nature versus nurture. And he focuses on positive and negative outcomes, and he believes that the ego actually is the most important part of the personality, whereas Freud said the id, or that original aspect of the personality, is the most important. And so for Erikson's first stage, he says that caregivers need to consistently respond to children's or infants' needs, and if they do, the infant will develop trust. If it's inconsistent, then the infant will not trust their environment. And by the way, Erikson's and Freud's stages are sequential and really must be accomplished with a positive outcome in order to effectively move on to the next stage. So for toddlers 1 to 3, for Erikson, the positive outcome is autonomy or independence. And you can directly see how this ties to Freud, because Freud's anal stage, the positive outcomes would happen with the toilet training issue. Through this, caregivers should give toddlers opportunities to do things on their own. If we're always doing things for them, their self-confidence is going to be inhibited, and the negative outcome of shame and doubt will happen. Freud and Erikson. Erikson builds on Freud's ideas. Freud believed the id part of the personality is the most important. Erikson believed that the ego was, and that development depends not just on nature but also on nurture. Another psychoanalytic theorist who kind of leaned towards ethology is Bowlby and his attachment theory. His ideas evolved from biological experiments of Harry Harlow looking at monkeys and whether the sustenance they got from their mother was most important, or was it the physical comfort and contact. And then Erikson's ideas of the quality of caregiving and how that works together with nature. And so Bowlby came up with his ideas about attachment. He said attachment is a close emotional relationship between caregivers and the child. And this, just like temperament, is something we have patterns of attachment that follow us all through our lives, even though we start to talk about it for infants and toddlers. And so John Bowlby said that this attachment behavioral system is exhibited because infants stay close to their mother or caregivers for survival, and they use those adults as a secure base for them to explore and then come back and get some comfort. And so they'll go out and explore for a while, but then they have to come back and make sure everything's okay by finding their attachment figure. So according to Bowlby and his student Ainsworth, by 8 to 12 months, infants develop an internal working model, or what they expect. This is their system for reliability, consistency, warmth, and effectiveness of caregiving responses. And this was all established through some experiments called strange situations. And this was an observational measure of infant attachment, in which the infant experiences a series of introductions, separations, and reunions with the caregiver and an adult stranger in a prescribed order. And so they would arrive at the experiment site with their caregiver, and then the caregiver would leave, and a stranger would arrive in the room. And that wasn't what the experimenters were most interested in. What they were interested in was how the child or infant reacted after with the caregiver after the stranger left and the caregiver came back. So once researchers had to follow the guidelines of an internal review board, we could no longer do strange situations, because that is detrimental to the child. It upsets the child. And fortunately, there was enough data to develop a question sort where parents decide with a set of questions which most applies to their child, which would be a 5, and what least applies to their child would be a 1. And so that's a question sort developed from the strange situation, and that's how we establish attachment. So there are 4 patterns of attachment. 62% of infants were securely attached, and these babies used their caregiver as a secure base from which to explore the environment. 15% were insecure avoidant, and these babies showed insecurity by avoiding the mother upon reunion. Insecure resistant is babies often cling to caregiver, then resist the caregiver by fighting against the closeness, perhaps by kicking or pushing away or biting. And then insecure disorganized, which is the smallest percentage, and these babies are disorganized and disoriented, which can indicate in some cases abuse. Okay, so 4 patterns of attachment, and of course the one that's most desirable is securely attached. Something to keep in mind, because this is a relationship between 2 individuals, a child may have a secure attachment to one parent and an insecure attachment to another parent. So sensitive, responsive caregiving is related to secure attachment. Caregivers of insecure, avoidant infants are intrusive in the infant's activities, or they reject the infant's attempts at social engagement. So you can see how this relates to Erikson's ideas of trust and autonomy. Caregivers of insecure, ambivalent infants, the parents are, or the caregivers are inconsistent in their responses. So again, for secure attachments, we need sensitive and responsive and trustworthy caregiving. So no matter what attachment category a child fits in, between the ages of 6 and 9 months, infants of all cultures develop separation anxiety. Before this time, their attachments are not secure, are not distinctively formed, and that just means that they're worried about leaving the individual who leaves them behind. And they're also hesitant about strangers because they don't know how to react around a stranger or what to expect from them. And so in a toddler classroom, you can see this stranger anxiety exhibited very well, because if a strange person comes into the classroom, maybe to look at the plumbing, and the toddlers don't know that person, they'll freeze, and it's like a movie is placed on pause, and they're looking to their attachment figures or adults that they've established attachments with to decide how they should react. And if the attachment figure smiles, then they'll go on with what they were doing before. Another issue with separation anxiety is in infant centers. Parents may get upset because infants earlier, before 6 months to 9 months, they were perfectly fine with being left at the center and the parent going to work. But all of a sudden at 6 to 9 months, they start crying. And parents worry that something's happened, or they're not being treated positively at the center, but it's not really that. It's a developmental issue. Between 9 to 12 months, 3 aspects of the infant's ability to coordinate emotional and intentional responses emerge. They're going to start pointing and gesturing. Just like we pointed out with the holophrases and the telegraphic speech. And they're going to be focusing on what other people's attention where other people's attention is focused, and they're going to solicit others to look where they're interested. And then they'll do social referencing, which is what we just mentioned earlier in my example for stranger anxiety. They're looking to attachment figures to know how to react to new situations. Infants form attachments not only with fathers, but with anybody else they interact with on a regular basis. Caregivers of insecure, disorganized infants may maltreat the child. We mentioned that before. And infant temperament, such as a high degree of negative emotionality, may also contribute to attachments because it makes that child more difficult to care for. So insecure attachments are more likely in families with higher rates of marital conflict and low levels of marital satisfaction because the environment is more negative. And if the parents use alcohol and drugs because their caregiving tends to be less positive, and if they're living in poverty where they have less resources and there's more stress. Attachment relationships improve when family stressors decrease. So the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development says that time spent in non-maternal care or child care relates to insecure attachment only when it's combined with less sensitive caregiving by mothers. Child care does not generally have a negative impact on infants and toddlers. Secure attachment is the most common pattern across cultures, so that's good news. Infants in all cultures studied use the mother or caregivers as secure base, and particular behaviors to promote secure attachment may vary, though, by culture. So compared with insecurely attached children, securely attached children are rated by others as more socially competent, less aggressive, and more emotionally positive, and they're less likely to develop problems in the future, like having behavioral issues, which would be externalizing problems, or internalizing problems like headaches or stomach aches. Again, NICHD found that secure attachment at 15 months and sensitive parenting at 24 months show highest levels at age 3 on developmental outcomes of social competence, language skills, school readiness, and absence of behavior problems, which makes sense. If the child is securely attached, they're going to have more positive outcomes.